Hey folks, how's it going? Question here. Employee benefits in COVID-19. Can a company make you wear a mask? What if you're an employee? What if you're a customer? Let's dig into this. This is something that has been causing problems for a lot of people. I just want to start with the usual warning that this isn't financial or legal advice. I'm not selling anything. And again, this is a time sensitive issue. So uh, watch out for that. And also, these are just my opinions, nobody else's. So, can a company make you wear a mask if you're an employee or a customer? Pretty simple question. Answer: sure, yes. Why not? Although that not very satisfying for a lawyer. A lot of context. So the usual lawyer answer: it depends, right? That's the answer every lawyer wants to give to every question. It's always right. It depends. That's never wrong, which is a great lawyer answer. So let's compromise and say yes, asterisk. So, can an employer require employees to wear a mask? Yes, asterisk. Uh, well, what about can an employer require contractors to wear a mask at work? Yes, asterisk. And again, what about a company and customers or visitors? Can it require a mask? Yes, asterisk. All right, so that does it. I guess. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you want some context? Did you want some actual legal advice? All right, fine. Fine. We'll actually answer when and why it's appropriate, I guess, if you're really a glutton for punishment. So once again, the short answer is public health is going to be the why, and to some extent the when to all of this, right? Public health. Every law has some kind of exception to protect the public from significant dangers. Uh, and in this case, governments at all levels, including foreign governments, federal, state, local, have endorsed the idea that COVID-19 is very dangerous, and they've even enforced some extreme measures to stop it, like closure and lockdown orders in various jurisdictions. So let's just presume that it is very serious. I know some people dispute that, but this is the law. The government has said that it's dangerous. Let's just presume that it's incredibly dangerous, and pretty significant measures are justified under the law. So proceeding from that, let's see the CDC advice. CDC has recommended cloth face coverings, masks. So not respirators, but something to obstruct your face from infecting other people's faces, essentially. So let's just assume COVID's dangerous, incredibly dangerous, and let's assume that masks are good because that's the advice from the government so far. So a more legal answer, a more sophisticated sounding answer. The most important is that in many cases, an employer or a company might actually be obligated to require masks of its employees or its customers. So that's just the law. And if it is the law, then they have to follow that. So why? When? Well, when required by law, obviously they have to do it. And you might try to refuse as an employee or a customer, but it is the law. In other situations, just generally speaking, an employer does have the power to set certain conditions for how employees work, and that includes the safety of other employees and also the safety of customers or the public. And that's also true for contractors for the same reason, to safeguard people, and for companies have the power to regulate customers as well, to safeguard employees, to safeguard other customers, and to safeguard the general public. And these are all just general private property and private company type rules. They have the ability to set certain rules, and that's not a cop out. That's a basic legal principle. Uh, it's also important to remember that we're still in sort of uncertain legal ground, and there is some threat of liability. In this case, that could mean basically companies could get sued, employers could get sued if they expose people to COVID risk. So there is a good reason to try and prevent COVID risk to the extent it would be pretty easy and cheap to reduce that risk by making people wear masks. It's also important to remember that refusing to wear a mask for political reasons is not a protected class, so it's not generally protected against discrimination. And even discrimination statutes would have exceptions for safety, like spreading infectious disease. And there may, in many cases, actually be an obligation for an employer to protect its employees from infection risks. So you might even argue the opposite. Not only could an employer force you, but it's possible, some might argue, that an employer is required to make you wear a mask. An employer could not choose to let you go without a mask. I think that's probably a little too strong, but certainly there's a strong interest in protecting employees, and The extent of that is not exactly clear, but employers have some sort of duty and certainly a level of power to make you wear a mask in order to protect their employees, their other employees. And so obviously I want to include caveats as a lawyer, but all these orders are changing rapidly, including how they relate to masks. There are non-discrimination statutes. They could constrain what sort of mask mandates a company or an employer has. And the employer may have to train you, if you are an employee, to wear the masks appropriately or how to force customers to wear them. So, all things to consider that I couldn't really go into because they're way too big. But I do want to jump to just some of the really heinously awful arguments on the internet about mask mandates. And really, this is just if you're getting free internet advice on COVID law, you get what you pay for. And unfortunately, that applies to all of you because I am free. So you get what you pay for. You pay me nothing. So this is worth nothing. I hope it's better than nothing. Let's go. Let's go with that. I want to reproduce some of the silly mask arguments just to get into the legal issues. So a lot of them start with some version of, oh, you have an unidentified medical condition and you can't wear a mask. And then here's just a really awful one. Oh, the ADA prevents you from requiring me to wear a mask. That would be discrimination. And you might have seen this thing floating around the internet. I don't even know if people actually used it, but it's certainly on the internet. And it's funny to laugh at because it's just wrong on a number of obvious levels. But whether or not people actually use it, I think it's useful for discussion purposes. It stimulates a discussion. So this is wrong, and I think most of us could probably understand that that's wrong. Um, if you refuse to wear a mask and you refuse reasonable accommodation for a political reason, it's just very unlikely that you could sustain an ADA discrimination claim, a disability discrimination claim. It's just very unlikely. And I'm just assuming that the rule is focused on safety and it's enforced fairly and it's not arbitrary and they allow reasonable accommodations, whether you're an employee or a customer or a visitor or a contractor. And in that case, it's very unlikely, especially if your refusal is primarily political. Um, so again, we've got an unidentified medical condition that somebody on social media and on Facebook or Twitter, YouTube or whatever is saying that prevents them from wearing a mask, and they might say something like, "Oh, HIPAA prevents you from even asking me," or the ADA prevents you from asking about my disability. That would be a violation. And again, this card says it there, and it says some big numbers for penalties, and it gives the information line and tries to make it sound really scary. Well, first of all, it's almost certainly not HIPAA violation because HIPAA does not generally cover employers. It's not just a free-floating obligation on employers. It does cover your employer group health plan, which, as an employee benefits lawyer, I feel the need to point out, but it does not just cover employers generally when they deal with their employees. It also just doesn't cover how retail or grocery stores interact with the public. So it doesn't apply there. Even if HIPAA did apply, there is an exception, a relatively narrow one, for actions to avoid an imminent threat to health or safety, if it's a serious imminent threat. It's actually a relatively narrow exception, but even if HIPAA did apply, it's just not nearly as expansive as some people seem to think. Obviously, it has some reasonable limitations for public health and safety and so forth. ADA violation is also unlikely. There's not just an absolute privacy right. ADA is a discrimination statute, not a privacy statute per se. So making narrow inquiries in order to find a reasonable accommodation, it could be reasonable. Now, I would say that if a company is considering a policy, they should probably try to avoid asking directly, what's your disability, what's your illness, questions like that. It's best to avoid and just focus on the solutions, mostly because the communication problem. It can be very difficult to communicate clearly that it's not discrimination against your disability or your illness or your condition. It is focused on reasonable accommodation, but asking is not necessarily prohibited. There's not just a privacy right. An interesting twist, ADA is more likely to work the other direction and might actually protect people who want to wear a mask, both because the appearance of disability, which a mask might communicate, is protected, but also if an employee shows a medical need for a mask, then they could probably get away with, they could probably use the ADA to protect their right to wear a mask, even if the employer preferred they not. I'm not sure that's been established yet, but a lot of people are making that argument. So sort of an interesting subject. But I don't know that we have an exact conclusion, but I think it's more likely to work pro-mask than anti-mask. So it's probably not a good uh, political argument for someone who is skeptical of masks. So what about legitimate reasons to refuse to wear a mask? Well, it basically comes down to if it interferes with your job duties or your safety or a medical condition, um, then it probably would be legitimate. And what happens then? So that might be if it obstructs your ability to do tasks or to see, if it makes your working conditions unsafe, like maybe it could get caught in machinery or something, or what if it's medically counterindicated, right? So you have a respiratory condition, something like that. Well, you can refuse to wear the mask. The company, again, might have to offer some alternatives or some reasonable accommodations, which would vary depending on the circumstance. Uh, they could still potentially exclude you for the safety of other people present if there are no reasonable accommodations that they can agree on. Uh, Now, if you're an employee, OSHA might apply. You might have job protection, so that is a whole can of worms that I'm not going to try to get into too much, but that is absolutely in play if you're an employee. But that does not necessarily mean that you can just refuse for political reasons. So, um, uh, interesting subject that is possible to refuse. So, just in general, what are some of the takeaways here, right? So, what do you need to go away with? What let me simplify this a little bit more. Um, Obviously, it's a complex area of law, so it could come down to so many different details. I don't want to overly generalize. Um, Really, the answer is it depends, as usual. That's always the lawyer answer because it's never wrong. Um, but there are some big takeaways, right? So the company might actually be obligated by a state or local order to require masks. Simple enough. A reasonable measure to reduce infection, as long as it's enforced fairly and it's not discrimination, it's probably going to be fine in most circumstances. Um, in some cases, employers might actually be required to to have a mask rule in order to keep the employees safe. That's not exactly clear yet, but it's certainly something that's out there. And so, if you're against the masks, you might have to bear that in mind. The law could go the opposite direction. Um, and then I think the most important thing is to stop all the yelling and the fighting over masks. I don't think that's really productive for anybody. So don't yell at employees that are doing their jobs. Don't yell at other customers whether they are or aren't wearing masks. And if you're an employee, don't go. Feel free to ask for instructions. Ask for some rules and get some guidance on how you're supposed to proceed because you don't need to start fights with customers. There should be some kind of escalation procedure in place. So obviously, if you're finding yourself getting into a shouting match or a fist fight over masks, that's just a great way to spread COVID. So you don't want to end up with that. So everybody, just take it down a notch, please. Don't get into this. Don't get crazy. This is not worth fighting over. It's not worth shouting. I understand tempers are high, but this is not something that needs to be fought over. So I hope that helped. I hope that simplifies some of the crazy stuff you might have read or seen out there. And just remember, it always pays to be a little skeptical when you see someone talking about the law online, as I'm doing right now. So be skeptical of me. Go ahead for it. I encourage it. But I hope that this was helpful and stay safe out there.